So schools are moving to, including our district, are moving to more and more secure environments. The Raptor system is the only one that's BOCES aidable, and it's a means where a state-issued ID, being a passport or a driver's license, is scanned upon entry into the building. The scanning system then produces a time-sensitive ID sticker. It also simultaneously scans that person's information to find out if there's any reason not to admit them into the building. And it's a pretty standard system in a lot of school systems. The decision point is, if we're launching new entryways that are more secure, and we should launch this system at the same time. That way we're instructing our visitors on a new means of entering the building all at once.
And so, in that, given the construction plan and so on, that would correspond.
Absolutely.
Cool, thanks.
For the purpose of this proposed draft, we're still using the governor's budget proposal from January. We're hoping, as I mentioned at the outset, that we'll have a state budget for April 1st, although I know there's quite a bit of conversation going on there at the state level right now. Revenue sources, we increased $20,000 in the federal aid category, which is our Medicaid reimbursement, which is different than last time. Also had an adjustment in the tax levy to show the cuts that we made, so the reduction from where it was last time. So we currently have a tax levy of $16,533,000, which is our cap number, which we'll get to in a second. And also at the bottom, I've updated the percentage received from state aid and the tax levy against the full budget. So you see 41% and 53.8%. Again, major changes over $5,000. Building aid is the big one, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. There's a decrease on the revenue side of $2.28 million.
And Mr. Forbes, just, I apologize, could you just quickly go back to that last slide? Not so much a question. Thank you.
In terms of budget caps, if the budget is defeated twice by the voters, we would still need to comply with the administrative cap. We're currently $278,000 under that, so there's no problem there. And if the district were to seek a supermajority, which right now we're at the cap, we would require a 60% or more majority. As I mentioned, the cap calculation here based on the factors that go into it this year, the growth factor and the CPI. We were able to have a maximum tax cap without the supermajority of 2.95%, which would be an increase over the 18-19 levy of $473,000, which gives us a maximum tax cap of $16,533,000, and we're currently at that. So in terms of your budget summary, we're actually a decrease of $1.7 million, which is a reflection of the changes in debt service, or a negative 5.36% compared to 18-19. And in terms of historical data, that takes you back somewhere in the neighborhood of the 15-16 school year in terms of total dollars on total budget.
So in this slide here, you're looking at the 18-19 budget and the proposed 19-20 budget. If we were to look at actual 4-year numbers, where would this progression be?
In terms of what it was in the past 4 years?
Actual.
Actual final spent?
Yes.
Going back to 16, 17, 28, 9, 17, 18 was 30.6, and we're projecting 31.5 for this year.
So we're looking at each year over the past 4 of budgeting a negative if we don't include the putbacks. And if we don't consider drawing from our fund reserve, we're projecting a negative. So we're pulling about $1 million in each of the past 4 years.
That's correct.
In each of the past 4 years, we've added instead of taking away.
Your fund balance has grown, yes.
And Mr. Forbes, sorry, 16, 17, what was the actual? To
28,975,000.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to go to this slide first. The district, as we've been discussing fund balance over the last few months with the audit committee and also at the board level. The district has the opportunity to do one-time expenditures. A one-time expenditure would be something that you would put into the budget essentially after your budget is set where you would like it to be, and then you offset it directly by applying additional fund balance monies against it. What that does is does not change the effect on the cap, does not change the effect on the levy, and after the year in which you do the one-time purchase, expense comes off, revenue comes off, and you're back to where you started before that. So a couple of things we're looking at here. For middle school math, we've purchased, or are in the process of purchasing, a 5th grade digital math series using current year monies. And then we would propose to use this one-time expenditure on the rest of it for grades 6, 7, and 8. And then also we're looking at the possibility of adding a district vehicle, like a 7-passenger kind of thing that could be used for conferences or transportation of small groups of athletes or students to events as opposed to having to pay for a full bus kind of thing. So that would also be an opportunity to do a one-time expense.
And that'd be about 0.5% on the
Well,
levy.
it wouldn't affect the levy at all because you'd be offsetting it with fund balance. So
I'm sorry, so about 0.5% off the unappropriated unassigned fund balance.
approximately. So that takes us to the final on your tax levy and tax rates. Left-hand column is labeled 326 proposed budget. That's where you stand today. Tax increase of 2.95%, a levy increase of $473,000, which is your cap figure. Tax rate in the town of Pomfret, which comprises about 84% of our district, will be $3.65 a thousand, and the average over the 5 towns that we do have ARC rate, Portland, Sheridan, Dunkirk, and of course Pomfret, would be $2.83. If you were to say hypothetically, what happens if we go to 2%? 2% on the levy would require an additional $152,000 of either revenue or cuts or application of fund balance, and probably a combination of all three from where you stand today. That would give you a tax rate in the town of Pomfret of $2.47 and an average of $1.92. Following the same scenario, the next column, option 2, you can see what it is at 1%. It would require a cut of $313,000 from where you are today, and a tax rate in the town of Pomfret of $1.24. And finally, the last option, if you were to say to go to a 0 tax increase, the difference would be cutting $473,000 from where you are today. And of course, then it would be a 0 tax increase in the town of Pomfret.
I have a question.
From a numerical standpoint, as I mentioned previously, if you go below the tax cap in any year, it becomes the number for which your subsequent tax cap is calculated. So if we were to say in the next year, for whatever reason, the growth factor and the CPI came in really low, and your formula ran really low, and your tax cap increase was 0.2%, it would be based on the fact you had 0. So if you go to completely 0 out, you run the risk of basically creating a hole in revenue in a year, depending on whatever the other factors. And that includes finalizing this year's expenses and seeing what the fund balance comes in this year in comparison to what we've already done. And same thing if you bridge anywhere in between the cap, the way that it's set up by the state, that difference would be what could be considered to be lost revenue in subsequent years. Also could work out fine if you have, the fund balance is good and things come in good, it can work out fine too. So I just felt the need to point that out. So from this point, we're bringing to the board for the next meeting whatever the final budget would be for your approval. We have to do that before spring break because the Tuesday after spring break, or one day beyond, we have to legally approve it. And if we're going to have changes between now and then, the board's going to need to give Mr. Certisio and myself some direction as to what that might be.
So, how about questions for Mr. Forbes?
I did have one, but that was the exact question that he answered already, so.
So we're voting on this on the 9th?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So, let's just talk about a few things then. Currently, since we appropriated some monies from our unappropriated fund balance into reserves. So got several things going on. We've got from our external audit and then the controller's audit, we have a fund balance that exceeds the state's 4% under the real property tax law. We've had to have recommendations or thoughts back to the controller about how we intend to intelligently use that reserve and also protect the district. And so with the unappropriated fund balance as identified at, let's say, the beginning of this fiscal year, so 2018, 2019, we have moved funds into other reserve accounts, and that has reduced our unappropriated fund balance to what amount, just ballpark at this point?
Well, you're absolutely correct. What we did, we had about 3.6 million in reserve, from which we finalized the transfer of money to the capital reserve fund. That was $200,000 that needed to go there. And then we did two transfers, one to the retirement contribution reserve and one to the tax certiorari reserve a couple of months ago. So you're probably looking at 3.2 right now.
So total really is about $400,000 that we moved.
And then part two of that is this evening to approve language which would allow for a proposition to go before the voters in May to create a second capital reserve funded up to $750,000. You don't have to put that amount in at the front end, it just gives you the opportunity to do that. You do have a capital reserve that we're using for the current project, of which there'll be about $150,000 left. However, under the regulations of the state, we can't fund any more into that reserve. We're only allowed to fund up to what was originally approved, and you can't do the subtraction because you take some out, but you can add some back. It's capped at whatever you originally established. So by creating the second reserve, that would allow you to have an opportunity to create a capital reserve for whatever the next future project is in whatever time period that you can, based upon whatever you funded it.
Okay, and so just ballpark, what I'm understanding then is that with the transfers of the approximately 400,000, that probably takes us down to about 8.5%. Is that fair?
If you fully funded the capital reserve and took into consideration the changes that you've already made this year, that would get you in the 8% range.
Okay, and, okay, hang on just a second. Thank you. Just bear with me for a minute. So I just want to run a few things out. So relative to, if we were to fully fund, if the capital reserve is approved, and we were to fully fund it in 1 year, which I know that hasn't been the discussion at the audit committee, and Mr. Aldrich is shaking his head suggesting, boy, that's really crazy. Okay.
I don't think that would be a good idea. To do it in 1 year.
I think I started with bear with me. But just trying to get a sense. And so, yeah, so then, okay, so if we looked at option 2 or option 3 here, okay,
That should be a 3, not a 2.
what's that?
It should be 1, 2, 3, not 1, 2, 2.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I didn't even notice that. I assumed that was 3, but sure. So if we went with option 2 or option 3, your suggestion, and of course it would be Mr. Certisio effort as well, your suggestion was that you're probably looking at a mix of both additional unappropriated fund balance, which we currently are budgeting at 1 million. Also reductions in expenditures, but those would have to be reductions actually that are, because it would be as to the tax levy. I mean, that we're actually trying to reduce. And that represents, and I apologize, I think it was about 53% is locally funded of our proposed budget, if I remember that.
That's based on information we have today.
Right, and the governor's budget.
And the governor's budget.
Yeah, and the governor's budget. So it would be expense side, it would be unappropriated fund balance. I'm understanding that, and I apologize, for this fiscal year, how much of a fund balance did we use?
We applied $1
million,
million.
and we're thinking we're gonna get back possibly 950, 900.
We're probably gonna be between 7 and 9.
Okay, 7 or 9, so we're not replacing all of that million, which means, if we said 8, that means we're taking $200,000 out of really unappropriated fund balance. Realistically, we're gonna have $200,000 less. And then, was there a third thing that we'd have to look at relative to unappropriated fund balance, reduced
Well,
expenditures?
you're hoping that in the state's final budget that we would have additional.
Some
state aid.
additional
So,
amount.
the history has been lately that we do, but we're not talking about 600,000 or
Huge
700,000,
amounts.
we're talking about 100,000 if we're lucky.
Yeah. And what is the recommendation, Mr. Aldrich? I think you're the only one from the audit committee here. What's
Because
the
I can
thought
say whatever
about-
I want, and nobody
That's why I'm suggesting it's a great
Well,
opportunity. No, for the capital reserve.
what we were looking at is looking at this on a year-by-year basis. And that we were not going to set ourselves up in cement and saying, this is what we're gonna do every year. What we were looking at is potentially putting in 175 to 150,000 the first year, and potentially doing that for 10 years. But there's way too many factors that are coming into play before we commit ourselves to that. And I'm looking at this saying, if the voters decide that it's okay to create this account, this capital reserve account, and they're not funding it, the voters aren't funding it, they're just allowing the creation of the account. I don't see the board, or I would hope that we wouldn't get a recommendation to start funding that until we knew exactly what happened in the 2018-2019 year. So
The end of this year.
So if the number comes out to be, holy cow, we didn't do anything, you know, that 700,000 that we were talking about in the end of March 26th, really didn't amount to anything, then we're not going to fund 150,000. But if that number comes out to be 1.5 million, then I think that we've got a little bit more leeway here as far as increasing that amount that we put into the capital fund.
Yeah, but the 1.5 million, I mean, you know, is, the 1.5 million, of course, then we have to factor in what we're looking at really on this screen. I mean, while that does like show up at the end of the year, if we're taking more unappropriated fund balance and applying it to the tax levy in the upcoming budget year.
Yeah, and I'm saying if the 2018-19 year, we create more revenue, more of a reserve fund balance, we'll have more to put in.
Right. Except we're drawing out of the unappropriated fund balance if we go to 2 or 3, 1, 2, or 3.
Option.
Yeah. Okay, so then, Mr. Forbes, when you look at the tax cap, there's, and I don't know if you could answer this right off or not, but how many factors are in the tax cap? Just off, I mean, you always run through it and.
They're taking a look at teachers' retirement system and employees' retirement system, and at times, if there's a significant increase, you get a deduct for that. That didn't happen this year. They're taking a look at any lease payments that you have, and we do on copiers, but it's relatively modest amount of money there. They're looking at the consumer price index and a state supply growth factor that's based on some large formula the state has. And then that's all applied against your prior year tax levy. So
Okay.
the common thought of the tax cap when it came out, we talked about this before, is that it was a 2% cap. It's not a 2% cap. That's the base, and then you have these exclusion opportunities which vary by district, and also debt service factors in there as well. So in our case, the 2% became 2.95%.
Okay, so I think two questions related to that then. One is, so what's the single largest factor that goes into the tax cap in your estimation?
District to district or from the state standpoint?
Both. Let's go with both.
District to district is going to be debt service. If you had a large increase in debt, you might have, in case your exclusions get messed up, and there was a district downstate. I saw an article recently, they have like an 18% tax cap because of how their debt service flows. I don't know where it was, somewhere downstate. So that's there. And then year to year, you're basing it on your prior year tax levy. So if you have a good year like this year is 2.95, it gives you $473,000 of opportunity for a small increase, which we had a couple of years ago, and I think we were 0.87 a couple of years ago. With math, we're talking an increase of, say, under $200,000 on a levy, and you have to factor in what other things may do. How much is insurance going up? How much is utilities going up? All those things may go up more than 0.5 or 0.6%.
Sure.
But we don't know the weights of this.
Okay, so there is something you did say, and I just want to try to tackle that if I could. And that is, you say, look, you know, it's kind of a misunderstanding that it's a 2% tax cap, because in fact, it can vary off of the 2%. So I guess the question I have is 2% the base from year to year, and then there's variations up of that, above that, based on all these other factors?
On paper, 2% would be what it would be, but it's not that way because it's automatically driven by the consumer price index. So if the consumer price index comes in low, you're not going to be 2% on a straight calculation without exclusions because you won't get there.
Yeah, and so the CPI for this year, just as an example, was, do you know what that was? What went into our
The
factor?
CPI was over 2%, but the language of the tax cap law limits it to 2% in the formula.
Cool. Okay, and so this year, though for this year's budget, we did have more than a 2% CPI.
Yes.
Okay. And the projection for the coming year, do you have a sense of that?
I would have no way to even guess on that one.
Okay.
You do well on Wall Street if you can figure that out.
No, I'm understanding, but I mean, there's more intelligent people than me here, obviously, so, you know, yeah, so that's an element that we would, what's the lowest that, you know, we've had to deal with relative to CPI? I mean, I'm thinking we had the Great Recession.
0.87 sticking in my head, 0.87.
0.87.
We might have one that was a little lower than that.
So just kind of food for thought, I guess, you know, that certainly is an element. Okay, and then, Mr. Aldrich, I'm just wondering, has the audit committee then, just looking at capital, funding the capital reserve, and with Mr. Sortisio, maybe Mr. Sortisio and Mr. Forbes, was there any discussion then about, how this is in the audit committee's mind, how this is all playing out relative to helping to meet what we've said we would try to do with the controller and our unappropriated fund balance?
Well, if we were to contribute towards the capital reserve fund, we would essentially be reducing the unappropriated, what were your 3 words there? Unappropriated.
Unassigned, unrestricted.
Unrestricted, I wrote them down here, I don't have them.
I just wanted to give you options,
Well,
so that everyone knows what we're
but it's-
talking about.
but it would pull that money off of that number, okay? And by doing that, we would reduce it from the 11% down to whatever it may be, depending on how much we contributed. So, that's a good thing that we're.
Bring it down to what?
It would be a good thing to bring it down in the state's view, because the state thinks that 11% is higher than 4%, which a good math student would. And they are suggesting that 4% is the appropriate unrestricted fund balance. So if we contribute to the capital reserve, that 11% comes down closer to the 4%.
Yeah, especially over time as suggested by the audit
Now,
committee.
so long as we don't continue to raise that unreserved fund balance.
Sure.
But part of my thought process in this, in moving money into the capital reserve, is I think a fund balance is a very necessary thing within a school district. I think we all, okay? The state is trying to restrict us on the unreserved fund balance. And I'm looking at this saying, in personal finance, everybody says, well, you need an emergency fund. And really, that's what our reserves are. It's an emergency fund. Because we've got a budget, we've got a plan for where we want to be. If we take money out of that emergency fund and put it in capital fund, we still have the same amount, but we just put it in a different account so that the state looks at us a little bit better. But we still have it.
Yeah, and also it's
So
an investment.
we don't, we may say that 11% is too much, but if we move it into a capital reserve, we still have 11%. Now,
Sure.
because one way or another, we're gonna get it back out.
Well, and plus
So-
we're
so-
not taxing for a capital project on that amount.
Well, we still have taxed for it.
We
We've just
have-
already collected it,
Yeah.
okay?
But we're not, yes.
We've already collected it. So, in my mind, if you say you need a $5,000 emergency fund personally, and you put money into a capital fund, 500 into it, well, do you still need the 5,000 reserve? I don't think so. And I think that we talk about what's an appropriate unreserved fund balance. I think we've all have agreed that 4% is too low. With some of the variability that the state has done as far as funding us, I think 4% is too low. But I think we all have agreed that 11% is too high.
So then it's an issue of what might be, well, certainly, and so the plan though is to address the Controller's audit report, which, you know, we've responded to. And so part of our plan going forward, though, as identified by Mr. Certisio and Mr. Forbes and the audit committee, relative to funding those reserves to the $400,000, trying to create this capital reserve project, capital reserve fund, and then, you know, looking at whether or not $1 million or something more could be contributed from the unappropriated fund balance to apply to this year's tax levy. All those things are meant to help address that 11% that you mentioned. So with that, you know, what I think, you know, because what typically has happened, we've got two things going on. We're going to be mentioning that there's going to be a budget forum where, you know, the public can come before we adopt the budget, because that's always been kind of the issue historically, is that we have a budget hearing, but that's after we've already adopted a proposed budget that's going to the voters. The budget forum is really the opportunity for folks to talk to the board about their priorities and what they'd like to see the district do. And so that's at our next meeting. The additional piece to this, though, is that last year we had a proposed budget. I think it was at the cap or thereabouts. And, you know, the discussion then revolved around using a lesser amount. I apologize. Reducing our budget below the tax cap. And when we came to that issue, I think we were at 1.5% or something, and there was some discussion about, well, you know, can we take it down to 1%? And what that did was essentially say, geez, you know, we've got to come up with $100,000, $150,000 from someplace, changes all of Mr. Forbes and Mr. Certisio's projections, really, and expenditures and so on. And so at this point, two things. We've got $1 million of unappropriated fund balance that we'd be using this year to get us to the cap without making any other changes to the proposed budget, but for whatever the state might do, and maybe they do that this coming weekend or not. Okay. So we've got $1 million. And is there any thoughts about what members here would like to see relative to using, you know, how do people feel about the cap? How do people feel about option 1, option 2, or option 3? Can we provide any sort of guidance at all to Mr. Certisio and Mr. Forbes with respect to some possibilities for this board at the next meeting, so that we're able to actually try to reach a consensus and have a budget to present to our public and our constituency. Very good. What do you want to see, Mr. Jampro?
No, actually, I do have a preference right now after this discussion. And I thank you and thank Mr. Alder and Mr. Forbes for the information. However, I'm a little reluctant to make a commitment at this point.
Yeah, no, it's not a commitment,
Yeah.
and
Well, even, I guess, whatever you wish to call it. But I would like to know if the audit committee will have an opportunity to meet again prior to our next board meeting. And then we have 2 members missing. And then if an opinion of the full committee prior to, you know, in my own mind, locking in what I think would be appropriate.
We are actually trying to schedule another meeting for a different reason for April 5th. We have 2 members that can attend and 1 that cannot, so we haven't addressed whether that will continue to be scheduled or not.
And
The other piece of it is if we were to go to that meeting and any changes were to be made, we're kind of on a tight timeline to get that information to the board for you to look it over and agree or disagree.
Because they were scheduled for a special meeting on April 16th, is that correct? Or is that when we have to finalize it? No.
around the
April
9th,
16th is for
you've
the
got to go
vote.
the 9th.
The 9th, and you may not be able to schedule one by then?
She might not be able to get one in before the 9th. Okay, but that's good. How about Ms. Gagnon?
And you could be anywhere in it, that was just.
Yeah, right. So I'm probably somewhere in the middle there. I'm nervous about 0 for those reasons, for the position that it puts us in for next year and then those subsequent years. So I just don't think option 3 is a smart choice. I think 1 and 2 maybe gets us to a point where we can